Hi everyone, I'm Dan Snow and I'm here to try and answer Google's most popular questions about World War II. It's the biggest, the most destructive, the most complex war in the history of mankind, so we're not going to cover everything. But this is what you guys have asked. I'm going to try and answer. Let's get on with it. How did World War II start? World War II started because Germany, Japan, Italy, they wanted empires. They wanted more resources. They wanted more land. They were ruled over by psychopathic men who had a lust for violence. And they decided that they would simply march into their neighbour's territory and take it. Japan attacked China. Germany attacked Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland. Italy attacked Ethiopia, Libya. And eventually, at one point, the other great powers of the world, particularly Britain and France, were like, no, enough, not happening. That war only got bigger when Germany, for example, attacked the Soviet Union, when Japan attacked the USA in Pearl Harbor and Britain in Southeast Asia on the same day. So the war just extended and extended until it sucked in nearly every single country in the world. Okay, next up. Where did World War II take place? It took place everywhere. Mainland Europe, the Caucasus, Scandinavia, Svalbard, Iceland, over and around Britain, North Africa, East Africa, the Middle East, Northern India, Southeast Asia, East Asia, a lot of fighting there, the Pacific Islands, and then all sorts of other places besides. I mean, Japan dropped a couple of bombs on the lower 48, on mainland United States of America. There was a bit of fighting in West Africa, I think it was in Senegal. There was an expedition to Antarctica. On the oceans, there was fighting really everywhere. There were battles and sinkings right across the world's oceans. There was a pretty big battle right at the start of the war in southern South America. There was lots going on in the Arctic. There was war at sea around New Zealand. Australia was bombed, Northern Australia was bombed. Sydney Harbour was attacked by Japanese submarines. So it was truly global, and I think weirdly the last Germans to surrender, way after the end of the war, they were actually a little unit stationed in Svalbard measuring the weather. Okay, next one. How long did World War II last? Well, the traditional dates for the Second World War, World War II, that we learn about in the UK is it went on from 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland to 1945 when Germany and Japan were defeated. But in America, the war lasted from 1941 to 45. Now in China, they remember the Second World War as raging from at least 1937 to 1945 because Japan attacked northern China in 1937. It was the start of massive warfare. But really, they were skirmishing from 1931 onwards. So if you're Chinese, well, the war went on for a long time. And then, of course, there's the end date. Well, actually, in many places, the fighting never really stopped. So you could argue that the Korean War was just a follow-on from the Second World War. You could argue that fighting in Indochina, in what is now Vietnam, that was just a follow-on from the Second World War. You could even argue that the whole of the Cold War in Europe and around the world, when the USA and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies faced off in Berlin and elsewhere, that was sort of a continuation of that global struggle as well. So maybe it didn't end until 1989. Maybe it's still going on now. So the short answer, conventional answer, particularly if you're British or Australian or Canadian in the Commonwealth, 1939 to 1945. But it very much depends on who you are and where you're from. It's anyone's guess. Right, who fought in World War II? Well, who didn't fight? Nearly every country on Earth got involved. And we should say that's largely because of the gigantic empires that still dominated the planet at the time. So take the British Empire, for example. It ruled over around a third of the surface of the Earth. So if you're in India or Burma or Fiji or Canada or New Zealand or Nigeria or South Africa, you're involved in World War II kind of whether you like it or not, because Britain is your imperial master. But you also see the French Empire involved, and that covers huge amounts of North and West Africa and big chunks of the Pacific as well. China's involved, the USA is involved, The Soviet Union's involved. So big chunks of the global population are involved just from those powers alone. But lots of independent countries, they got involved as well. Places like Brazil and Argentina and Mexico, they all got involved eventually against Germany, Japan and Italy, the Axis powers. Mongolia was neutral for much of the war, but in the end declared war on Japan. In terms of countries who did not get involved or didn't formally get involved, you've got Sweden, Ireland, Yemen, Portugal, Andorra, Spain, although they were a bit fashy. Was there a draft in World War II? Yes, men were drafted. Men were conscripted to fight on a massive scale. You needed manpower for this war. Millions of men were sent to war. In fact, sometimes the draft began before the fighting started. In September 1940, President Roosevelt signed a law requiring all men, 21 to 45 years old, to register for the draft. That was a year before the USA entered the Second World War. In Britain, a limited form of conscription, the draft, was brought in spring 1939. Again, in peacetime, very rare for the Brits. Recruiting people was different from country to country. In India, it was an all-volunteer force. In the Soviet Union, they just used to walk down the street and grab young men off the pavement, stick them in a uniform and send them to the front. There was no bureaucracy there. While people in Britain strangely remember conscription, the draft, as being something that happened in World War I, it was very much happening in World War II as well. And in fact, it continued way after the end of the Second World War. How was World War II fought? Sadly, it was fought in every single devious way that us humans could come up with. It was fought on the ground. It was fought with fists and knives and bayonets and rifles and artillery and rocket launchers. It was fought with biological and chemical warfare. It was fought under the ground in sewers and basements in places like the Soviet city of Stalingrad. It was fought in the air as aircraft fought each other, aircraft bombed targets on the ground. It was fought in space. Hitler's Third Reich fired the first man-made object into space, a ballistic missile, to try and strike targets in the West. It was fought on the oceans. It was fought under the oceans as submarines attempted to sink ships and each other. It was fought in the information space as rival teams of intelligence experts sought to break each other's codes and sow disinformation. It was fought in men's and women's hearts and minds as hugely sophisticated propaganda outfits waged a never-ending struggle to prop up civilian and military morale. It was fought using animals, elephants, dogs, pigeons. It was fought using inflatable tanks and fake scenery. It was fought with dummy paratroopers made of straw with fireworks attached to their feet. It was fought with exploding rats, with umbrellas, and with nuclear bombs. Did World War II have trenches? Yeah, it's a funny one, because we associate trenches with the First World War, with World War I. They're so iconic. And yet, humans have been using trenches forever. There were trenches way back in ancient times as besieging forces tried to find cover as they were attacking fortress walls. There were plenty of trenches in the American Civil War. But in the First World War, they reached their apogee when trenches stretched in an unbroken line from the Channel coast to the Alps. But there were a lot of trenches in World War II. There were trenches on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk, the Soviets built one of the biggest trench systems in history. There were trenches right across Italy in 1944. There were trenches on the Western Front as the Brits and Americans tried to batter their way into Germany. Trenches are a natural consequence of the lethality of warfare. As the air becomes filled with bullets aimed from afar, travelling at supersonic speeds, at shards of metal and high explosives bursting all around, humans have to do the logical thing, and that's to get underground, to put soil and rocks between them and all the things around them that are going to kill them, that are going to tear through flesh and bone. So right the way through World War II, people were digging trenches and taking shelter in them. What was World War II's biggest battle? Well, that is a difficult one. I mean, in terms of people involved, you probably would argue something like the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 43. If you take the fighting around the Soviet city of Stalingrad and going on that Caucasus front, the southern Soviet front at that time, it involved millions of men all fighting to the death in horrific winter conditions. But then you've got the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, the Battle of the Atlantic stretches from the first day of the war to the last day of the war. A massive assault on Allied trade and shipping, trying to strangle Britain and its allies to force them to make peace. That was a long, savage, brutal battle. But then you've got, well, so many others. You've got D-Day and the Battle for Normandy, in which hundreds of thousands of men fought to get on the beaches of Normandy and then break the German army in France. You've got other battles on the Eastern Front where massive Soviet armies smashed into German army groups. You've got the Bagration offensive in the summer of 1944. You've got the Dnieper offensive. You've got the final appalling battle for Berlin. In all of those battles, millions of men were involved. You got Hitler's last serious attempt on the Eastern Front, the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, which cost him 250,000 troops. You got vicious battles going on the Pacific Islands, like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, as the American steamroller ground the Japanese Empire into dust. So it really does depend on what you mean by the biggest. My personal vote is Stalingrad, that massive clash in the southern Soviet Union. Millions of men involved, possibly north of 2 million casualties. The biggest battle not just of World War II, but in history. Did women fight in World War II? Yes, very much so. It differed enormously from country to country. In the Soviet Union, a big proportion of their fighting strength was made up of women. There was Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She was a sniper, just one of many female snipers in Soviet forces. There was the 588th Bomber Squadron. They were all female, and the Germans came to call them the Night Witches. Women fought on the front line in all sorts of roles. There were women fighting in resistance groups across Europe. I've met Dutch and French resistance veterans who've been able to tell me their stories. In Britain, women served in a variety of roles in the military. They were actually drafted to serve, but they were not meant to fight on the front line. That didn't stop many of them getting caught up in the action. Some women were killed when Biggin Hill, for example, was bombed in 1944 by German aircraft. They were working in the operations room. Mary Ellis was a legendary female delivery pilot. She flew every type of aircraft, delivering them to frontline bases, and got a reputation as a better pilot than most of the men. The young woman, Princess Elizabeth, who would become Queen Elizabeth II, she served in the British Army, driving and maintaining trucks. So yes, women did a lot of fighting in the Second World War. What happened at Dunkirk? Good question. The British and French armies had been catastrophically defeated in the spring of 1940, one of the most dramatic defeats in military history. The French had retreated back towards France, and the British and some French had been trapped in a pocket on the coast around the town of Dunkirk. They faced annihilation. But the British organised a huge armada of ships and boats to rescue them from those beaches. Over 300,000 troops were able to get away from the German grip and were able to form the basis of a rebuilt British army. It was a retreat, but the Brits claimed it as a victory. Was Dunkirk a success? Yes, it was quite a success, but it was only a success because absolutely disastrous defeat was avoided. Dunkirk came right at the end of a catastrophic campaign for the Brits. They'd been forced out of Europe, they'd been defeated by the German Wehrmacht. But they were able to escape at Dunkirk, a very well-organised military evacuation. So yes, it was a success, but as Winston Churchill said at the time, wars are not won by evacuations. Was Harry Styles in Dunkirk? Yes, the actor, singer, actor Harry Styles was in the movie Dunkirk. Why did Hitler stop at Dunkirk? That's a great question. We don't know for sure. Traditionally, people have thought Hitler stopped at Dunkirk deliberately to kind of try and not humiliate the British Empire, that thinking if their army was able to escape, well, then maybe they might be more up for making a peace deal. I don't think that's true. I think Hitler stopped because his tanks and their crews were knackered. They needed maintenance, the crews were exhausted, there was no fuel, they were miles away from their supplies, and they knew the ground around Dunkirk was marshy, it was unsuitable for tanks. So the Germans wanted to wait for their supplies and for more troops to catch up with them before crushing the British in that Dunkirk pocket. On top of that, Goering, Hitler's idiotic, strutting, incompetent commander of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, assured Hitler, "You don't have to worry about crushing the Brits. I'll do it with my aircraft, with my dive bombers." He failed to do that. So because of Goering's assurances and just logistical problems, Hitler never quite crushed the Allies in Dunkirk in his jaws. Why did Japan and the US enter World War II? Japan entered World War II because it wanted to carve out a huge empire in Asia. It just did. So it started fighting in China, pushing ever further, and to support that war, it needed more and more resources. And there aren't many resources on the Japanese home islands. There's no rubber, there's no oil. So to get those things, it decided it needed to extend that war. It needed to invade Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, where it could get all those resources. So to win a war in China, they decided to start an even bigger war in Southeast Asia. The trouble is, they knew the Americans would never allow that. And so they attacked the Americans by surprise in their Pearl Harbor naval base in Hawaii. That brought the Americans very dramatically into the Second World War. It was a foolish decision. And there was more to come, because in the days that followed, out of nowhere, Hitler declared war on the United States as well. Lunatic. But to be fair, that was topped when Romania declared war on the USA. Whew. Why was Pearl Harbor attacked? Pearl Harbor was attacked because it was the main naval base of the Pacific Fleet of the US Navy, sitting there right in the middle of the Pacific with its aircraft carriers and its battleships. The Japanese feared the United States Pacific Fleet. The Japanese knew that they would not be able to go and conquer Southeast Asia and maybe even Australia and New Zealand if the Americans were sitting there with a powerful fleet in Pearl Harbor. And so the Japanese decided to neutralize them, to strike at them by surprise. The Japanese struck at Pearl Harbor with 6 aircraft carriers, smashing the US Pacific Fleet. They thought the Americans would be so shocked that they'd agree to step back, make peace with them while they conquered a big empire in Asia. It was insane. Instead, the USA built the biggest and most powerful navy the world has ever seen and destroyed every vestige of the Japanese empire. What side was Russia on in World War II? Well, Russia, we should say the Soviet Union, because in those days, Russia's empire included places like Ukraine and Georgia and the Baltic states and Kazakhstan. It was the Soviet Union. Now, interestingly, they were kind of on both sides in World War II, which they don't like to talk about. Initially, they had a deal with Hitler. They had an alliance with Hitler. They invaded Poland together. They invaded the Baltic states. They invaded Finland. Stalin wanted to extend his empire just like Hitler did. But then Germany attacked its old ally, the Soviet Union, in the summer of 1941. Stalin was very sad. And that brought Stalin and the Soviet Union into an alliance with Britain and eventually the USA as well. An unstoppable force of superpowers that would eventually overwhelm Germany. Who fought in the Battle of Stalingrad? Well, the Soviets were on one side. They were defending, they were desperately trying to hold on to their important industrial city of Stalingrad on the River Volga in southern Russia, the gateway to the Caucasus with its important oil fields. Against them were the Germans. They had smashed into southern Russia. Alongside the Germans, there were Italians, there were Romanians, there were Hungarians, there were some Croats. And collectively, these nations just fought what was the most awful and probably the largest battle in human history. Room to room, cellar to cellar, sewer to sewer. It raged from the summer of 1942 to the beginning of February 1943. Millions and millions of people were killed, wounded, and brutalized. It was one of the most dramatic battles of World War II. It looked for a time like the Germany and its allies were going to win. Then the stunning reverse of fortunes. The Soviets counterattacked, surrounded, and utterly destroyed one of the finest German field units. Okay, next one. Why was the Battle of Stalingrad important? It was so important. It was important just in military terms. It ripped the heart out of the German army on the Eastern Front. They really never recovered. With one small exception, it was just retreat, retreat, retreat. From the ruins of Stalingrad right through to the ruins of Berlin, their capital city. The German army, air force were never the same after the Battle of Stalingrad. But it also meant something in terms of morale. People around the world heard about this devastating defeat for Hitler's Wehrmacht. The myth of invincibility was stripped away. Soldiers began to believe that they could and would defeat the Axis powers. There had been other defeats for the Nazis. They had lost the Battle of Britain. They had been turned back at the gates of Moscow in late 1941. But the Battle of Stalingrad made it clear to the world that Hitler was now an underdog. There would be no more dramatic victories for Germany and its allies following Stalingrad. Did D-Day win the war? No, it did not win the war by itself. That's the thing about the Second World War. It was so enormous that nothing individually, no particular battle won the Second World War, but it was a very, very important part of victory. In the East, Hitler was facing an existential threat. The Soviet steamroller was battering its way across Eastern Europe and probably would have reached Berlin in the end. Hitler was probably going to lose the Second World War, but D-Day made it a certainty. The Americans, the British, and their allies landed on the beaches of Western Europe, opening up another front, another headache for Hitler. Now he faced two mighty military powers pushing in from both East and West. He was caught in a vice. So D-Day was the start of a very, very important campaign that would see catastrophic losses for the Germans when they could certainly not afford them. So D-Day was absolutely another body blow to the Germans. It shortened the war, and it did something else very important. It ensured that Western Europe would be liberated by the Western democracies, not by the Soviet Union. D-Day helped to defeat Hitler, but it certainly saved democracy in Western Europe from communism. What does D-Day stand for? Great question. D is simply for emphasis. It's like saying the day. That's the day we're going to do it. D-Day. So when military operations began, they began at H hour. So that exact time of day, H hour. So D-Day just stands for the day on which the Allied invasion of Northwest Europe will take place. Is Saving Private Ryan real? No. Next. What was the last battle? No, I'm kidding. Saving Private Ryan is absolutely influenced and inspired by real events. What you see in those extraordinary opening 15 minutes is a depiction of the assault on Omaha Beach at the beginning of June the 6th, 1944, D-Day. Now, I have talked to many veterans of D-Day, and to be fair to the makers of that movie, the veterans have said to me, when I've asked them what it was like on D-Day, they say, go and watch Saving Private Ryan. So it is a very, very powerful depiction of what happened. You get a sense of the challenges they faced, moving from those landing craft, the seasickness, the artillery striking them, hitting underwater obstacles. You get a sense of what it was like for them getting out into the water, some of them being weighed down by their kit, drowning, machine gun fire tearing into them. And then as they fight their way up the beach, through the barbed wire and through those German defences. It is a very, very good depiction of what D-Day was actually like. The rest of the movie, they do take a few more liberties. What was the last Battle of World War II? Well, the last Battle of World War II in Europe, there was fighting in the Battle of the Atlantic, there was still fighting going on in Italy, there was fighting going on in West Germany, but the last really major set-piece battle in Europe was probably the Battle for Berlin, which is just one of the most terrible battles in history. A totally hopeless, pointless, enormous, maniacal struggle between communism and fascism in the streets and the houses of Berlin, with monstrous war crimes on both sides and death and destruction. The biggest artillery barrage in history took place. The Soviets tried to break in to the German capital. Hitler forced children, old men, women into the streets to fight an absolutely fruitless, hopeless battle against overwhelming Soviet forces. It was a terrible finale to the Second World War in Europe. In Asia, the last battles were raging in Burma and China. The Soviets invaded northern China, Manchuria, in August of 1945. The last big American battle was probably for the island of Okinawa, which ran through the spring and early summer of 1945. But the ragged ends of the Second World War were being cleared up everywhere. In fact, one Japanese soldier didn't surrender in the Philippines until the mid-1970s. Okay, here we go. Who won World War II? Well, on one level, it's pretty clear. Germany ended up utterly smashed. Hitler put a bullet in his own head. Mussolini ended up getting strung up from a lamppost, the Italian leader, his country occupied. Japan ended up torched, struck by nuclear bombs. They had to unconditionally surrender. So yes, the Allies won, the United Nations, the Soviet Union, the British and its empire, the Americans, the French and all of their allies. But in the decades that followed, it became clear that some nations had benefited more than others. The Americans had become a globally dominant economic and military power. The British and French empires had been exhausted or pretty much broken by the Second World War, even though they're on the winning side. Did Winston Churchill win World War II? What a great question. Winston Churchill was the British Prime Minister, responsible for maintaining Britain in the war at that crucial time in the summer of 1940 where everything looked hopeless. Through his oratory, through his speeches and through his decisive leadership, he gave the British determination to stay in the war against Hitler and fascism. And that was super important. If Britain had surrendered at that point, yes, World War II might have ended with a German victory. But from that point onwards, I don't think Churchill's contribution to the war was the difference between victory and defeat. In fact, many of his own generals used to complain about his meddling. So Winston Churchill, yes, he was one of many hugely important political, military and scientific figures that were responsible for the Allies winning the Second World War. But did he win it by himself? No chance. How many people died in World War II? It's impossible to know. We think figures, perhaps 15 million servicemen died, servicemen and women died. Perhaps 35 to 50 million civilians. It is absolutely impossible to know. No proper estimation has ever been made, particularly of the Soviet casualties and mostly Chinese casualties. There could be tens of millions more. So as much as perhaps 100 million human beings killed in the war. And that's before we even talk about those that were wounded, traumatized, abused, or made homeless. Did the atomic bomb end World War II? Yes, the atomic bomb ended World War II in combination with a couple of other things. The Americans dropped two nuclear bombs on Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in early August 1945. But at the same time, the Soviets entered the war against Japan. They launched a massive offensive into the Japanese Empire in northern China. And so reeling from these two massive assaults, the Japanese agreed to an unconditional surrender. So the bombs were hugely important, but there were other factors as well. What if Germany had won World War II? Well, if Germany had won World War II, the world would look very, very different indeed. Germany would control an empire stretching from parts of modern France all the way, well, deep into Russia, perhaps as far as the Ural Mountains. Beyond that, there might have been German puppet states, including France, perhaps Britain, all the way to the Pacific. Japan would control an empire perhaps stretching all the way down to Australia and into India. I'm pretty sure that if Germany had built that empire, eventually Hitler would have turned his sights to the United States of America. And perhaps there would have been a massive battle for control in America. Would there be German armies landing in the Chesapeake, massive armoured battles taking place on the plains of the Midwest? It's mad to even think about. Oh, that's the last one. Well, thank you very much everyone for asking Google those questions. I share your fascination with the Second World War. One of the most important, tragic, fascinating and destructive events in human history. No wonder we're all still talking about it. It shaped the world that we're all still living in today. If you want to see any more World War II content, we've got it for you at History Hit. We've got my podcast, Dan Snow's History Hit. We have loads of films up on YouTube. We have travelled the world, we've met the veterans, we've been up in the sky, and we've been down below the ground on the hunt for great World War II stories. So make sure you like and subscribe to this channel and all our other stuff. I'll be back next time for more Google questions. See you then.